This is the weekly lesson for study until the 7th of July 2024. Subject: Teachers Then and Now. Women in particular used to have very defined roles in society, and I recall that my teachers in the 1970s and 80s were for the most part unmarried women. There was an expectation that they would devote their lives to education and could not be educators as well as look after a husband. Female teachers were simply not allowed to marry, culturally or legally. That rule had been officially lifted in 1944. Yet the tradition remained, likely out of fear that a community may judge a woman unfairly. After all, in the 1970s and 80s, most of our elders were born before 1944, and they themselves were educated by unmarried teachers. Sex, sexuality, and physicality were completely repressed during the 19th century, so a woman who was abstaining in order to educate children was a serious vocation. It was perhaps a throwback to a time when we would have been educated by Catholic nuns and priests. There were practical reasons for this as well, particularly regarding the high number of unemployed men. By default, we often refer to teachers as Miss rather than Mrs. because it showed more respect. Female teachers here in the UK were expected to be single until 1944. And if they were found to be married, then they were sacked. Women working was generally seen as something negative, but exceptions were made, of course, for cooks, cleaners, and general domestic roles. But even those kinds of roles were reserved for single women or spinsters who had no chance of marriage or a profession because of their age or class system. By the time the 1970s came, times were indeed changing, and more women were becoming teachers. Our social revolution of the 1960s had left its mark, and women felt empowered to do anything they wanted. The headmaster in my school was Mr. Cameron. Of course, the opinion was that his job as head teacher, with all of its administrative tasks, needed a man to manage it, and I often wonder how he dealt with 10 women on a day-to-day basis. He was an older man, never having been married himself. When he was due to retire, the school held special celebrations for him and wished him well. He was so taken by our love for him that he changed his mind and decided to stay longer, which perhaps gave us a glimpse into what his life was really like. Perhaps just like the rest of us, he had his own self-doubts and loneliness, but he was not allowed to show those publicly. The teachers I recall were very happy. The older ones, who were well past their sell-by date, seemed very contented. They were like matriarchal figures, quick to give advice with a very blunt, practical masculinity. Yes, they were all women, which surfaced when required. Corporal punishment was still in place until 1981, and you really did not want to be on the receiving end of that, especially if you were in any way squeamish. It involved being belted across the hands with a trouser belt or cane until you almost bled. The weirdest part of that punishment was the ritual. The most well-behaved boy in the class was sent to collect the belt from another teacher, giving the message to the other class that someone had been playing up. That belt was then carried back with great reverence to the class of the troublemaker so that everyone could see what was about to happen. A few of the teachers even cried when carrying out this brutality, as I recall, and on the other hand, excuse the pun, some of them enjoyed it. Questions remain in my mind about why a bunch of middle-aged women had men's belts hanging on the walls to punish us with. By the mid-80s, married teachers were becoming as common as single ones. In my community today, there are still a number of older teachers who choose not to marry, but they are mainly retired, morally upright women who look like relics from another time. And then, of course, there are also nuns. Some of them are in prison serving sentences for physical cruelty to children in the 1960s. Others are simply sweet old ladies. Times have changed, and now teachers are required to be formally educated. In the past, they simply had to attend teacher training colleges, whereas now there is an expectation that they will hold at least a degree. Headlines appear regularly about inappropriate relations between kids and teachers, as well as violent threats and lack of safety in the classroom. Some of the teachers do not look much older than the kids. As my colleagues and I discuss our experience of school days, one thing we all agree upon is this: we would never send our children to British schools. We would either homeschool them or live in another country. There is an opinion that, frankly speaking, children here are exposed to too many things. I yearn for the old days, but do understand things were not perfect then either. It simply looked that way, through the eyes of a child.